Mindful Happy Kids, created and narrated by Dr. Elisabeth Paige, consists of interviews with children's authors and poets and illustrators, musicians of all types, and yoga and mindfulness practitioners. Dr. Paige also reads from her own children's books on compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, and yoga. Pippi the Puppy and Dr. Paige practice meditations or pet-centered meditations, which are recorded as part of the videos. Hi, this is Maria Scrivan, and she is a New York Times bestselling author and syndicated cartoonist. And Maria, would you like to take a few moments to introduce yourself?
Sure, and thank you for having me here today. So I am the author and cartoonist for the Nat Enough graphic novel series published by Scholastic, and I also do the syndicated comic Half Full that is syndicated with Andrews McMeel and appears 3 times a week on gocomics.com.
Great. And you do greeting cards.
I also do greeting cards, and I've done a lot of magazine work as well. So I've had stuff in Mad Magazine and National Lampoon and Parade Magazine. So I've kind of covered the gamut of cartooning over the years.
Before we talk about the individual books and Half Full, can we talk a little bit about you and your writing process? Can you take me through your writing journal and your cartoonist journey?
Sure. So what I love about being a cartoonist is it kind of forces me to look at life through the lens of humor. And I've also done that with my middle grade experiences. So for the comic Half Full, I sort of go through life and I jot down ideas, and usually things that are really trying, aggravating, like the fact that I can't get through a self-checkout alone without help, that ends up becoming a comic. So it kind of forces me to look at things through humor. And so for my middle grade graphic novels, I kind of did the same thing. And I started out writing just vignettes of funny things that happened to me. And I should say at the time, they weren't funny. Getting bullied when it's happening is not funny. And I'm not making light of any of these situations, but I end up sort of looking at these feelings through the lens of humor. So I started out just sort of writing vignettes. And then because I'm such a visual learner and visual communicator, my writing process really starts with doodling. I just start drawing and then figuring out what the characters are saying and who they are. So a big part of my process is both writing and drawing together.
And what led you to Half Full?
So it was a childhood dream of mine to see my comic in the newspapers. So years ago, I just started submitting to magazines, and I got a bunch of stuff in Parade magazine, and that was kind of my start. I remember submitting, I think, 20 cartoons to Parade. I'm not even sure if they even publish cartoons anymore. I do know that they just kept getting smaller and smaller. But when they bought 20 of them, I thought, maybe this could work. And at the time, I had a graphic design business of my own, and my graphic design client list started to get smaller. My cartooning list got bigger, but I knew my dream was really to have it in the newspaper. So I started submitting to syndicates over and over again, and then eventually it got picked up by Tribune, and then also ended up getting picked up by Andrews McMeel. And I had it in the newspapers for a decade. I recently retired it from newspaper, but continue to have it online a few days a week.
Oh, that's great. And what do you find most challenging about doing comic strips?
Well, the daily deadline, along with the book deadline, was really challenging because, and also it's this idea of like, it's always there. So even if you're going through really big life things, or you're sick, or you're upset, or anything, you still have to be funny. So that's a challenge, but also kind of a good thing, because it would force me to sort of get out of my head. So if there was something sort of heavy going on in my life, I could sort of, if I could compartmentalize and then focus on the comic, it sort of distracted me from anything. But yeah, it's always there. And I would work months and months ahead, so that if something happened where I was really sick or something, that I knew that I sort of had a buffer. It's like, you have an inventory of comics ready to go.
Oh, that's great. And what do you find most rewarding about doing graphic novels?
Oh, so much. First of all, it's a childhood dream come true because I love writing and drawing, and actually did my first graphic novel in 6th grade. it was just Teacher Appreciation Week, and I got to do a big shout out to my sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Lamazo, who, when I was in sixth grade, had us do this book project. And it ended up being, of course, for me, my first graphic novel, because I had to write and draw it, because that's always how I've been. But doing that project sort of just gave me this confidence, and it was entered in a book contest and all this stuff, gave me this confidence and realization that that's what I love to do. So to have this as my career as an adult is truly a dream come true. So I love everything about the process. I love coming up with the characters, figuring out the story, inking it, coloring it in, and then that last kind of, I like to call it the sprinkles on the cupcake, when it's all done and it's gone through copy edits, and I sort of go in and get to look at each panel and think like, well, how can I make this funnier? What can I do to enhance this? I really love so much about the entire process.
And what are the challenges?
Oh, the challenges, yeah. So when I think my biggest challenge is when I get stuck on the story. And I like to say that I never really run out of ideas, but I often run out of good ideas. So there's moments where I'm just stuck and I feel like it's like a jigsaw puzzle, but I don't even have the pieces. So I'm a big meditator. I'm a yoga practitioner. I love running and riding my bike. I also love hiking in the woods. And I have to say, whenever I'm really blocked, a good walk in the woods usually solves it. And what I'll do is I'll actually write, a lot of the sections of the book were written just by me walking in the woods, and I'll just talk into the notes section of my phone and take notes as I'm walking. But I had a wonderful poetry teacher in college that always talked about the idea of movement. And he would say, you know, get in a train, car ride, bike ride. And I know for me, if I'm ever really stuck, if I go for a nice hike in the woods, that'll do it.
What do you think the advantages of having graphic novels with humor are for middle graders?
Well, what I think, humor definitely helps diffuse heavy things. So the first book, Nat Enough, it's all about Nat, who just gets to middle school and her best friend from second grade decides not to be her friend anymore. And that happened to me, and it is not funny at all. It was a really tough time, but I sort of got to kind of look at it again. And maybe that moment wasn't funny, but the things around it can be funny. You can sort of look at the whole big picture of middle school through humor. And the other thing that you also get to add with graphic novels is this incredible level of empathy. So you not only know what the main character is feeling, you know what all the other characters are feeling by what their expressions are, what the colors are, what people are wearing. You can tell what the weather is. So there's so many layers of depth to graphic novels in a way that is very different than prose. And I do a lot of school visits, and I know that many kids also love to draw. So I think it also inspires them to tell their own stories and draw their own stories.
Mm. People have said in past interviews that graphic novels are accessible to the non-reader.
Yes.
To turn them into a reader, and that graphic novels aren't necessarily lower quality in terms of like the level of English in a book, but that they enhance the vocabulary of a reluctant reader, and they'll encourage a reluctant reader to read all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I cannot believe how many both parents, educators, and kids themselves who have told me that my books were the first book they've ever read. And then they feel successful. It's a 235-page book. And they're, you know, if they can get through that, now they're like, oh, I can do that. I can read any other book now. So yeah, and I absolutely agree that these are just as much books as any other books. The vocabulary is strong. And then, like I said, there's so much more going on. And I think kids also love to reread them, because each time you go through, you start to notice other things in the background. You start to pick up on little clues that are left around. So there's a lot more to them.
Okay, let's talk about your comic strip.
Okay.
What kinds of things do you like to focus on in your comic strip?
Well, so you'll notice my dog, Toby, who's also so my little dog, Toby, is a long hair miniature dachshund. He's about 15 pounds or so. And a lot of the comics are what he might say to me if he could talk. He's also in the Nat books as the character Treat, because he will not come when I call his name. But if I say I have a treat, he'll come running. So I always joked I should have just named him Treat. And that's why I named the character Treat in the books. So I write in the comic book a lot about what my dog would say. I used to have cats, I no longer do, but I would write a lot about cat behavior and what they like to do. I like to write about social media and also the social condition. One thing I love about comics is they're kind of a time capsule. So when Google Glasses came out, I wrote about that. AI is now a thing. I write about that. So it kind of captures what we're doing in this time, what we're wearing, what the trends are, the things that are flying around in memes. So I like to sort of write about the human experience. And as I said earlier, oftentimes it's things that are frustrating to me. And I know that I write about things that are funny, but it's also anything that evokes a really strong emotion. I also do greeting cards. So I love writing about the holidays and Easter and Christmas. I just love drawing Santa Claus. I don't know why, but I love it. So I like to write about a lot of different things, but there definitely is a big focus on things that are of interest to me. So also, as I said, I love yoga. So I'll write about yoga, and I also love, cycling. So that'll end up in there. So it's things that I like and things that are frustrating, I guess, for me.
Can you talk about yoga in your life?
Yeah. So I've been practicing for a really long time. I think probably, 25, 28 years now. So
Wow.
it's something that I think for me, it's kind of everything all at once. I love exercise. I love the idea of being flexible, but both physically and mentally. So I think for me, it's like exercise and therapy and all these amazing things rolled into one, and
Do you
always been
think
a big
yoga,
part of my life.
do you think yoga can be helpful for the middle grader?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for confidence, because and one thing I love about yoga, and I've done all different types. I like Bikram, I like Vinyasa. But one thing that I've noticed about it is you're really just kind of competing with yourself. Not that there's any competition at all, but you may do those same like Bikram, you're doing 26 poses. Each time you can notice the slightest little nuance, but you're sort of advancing. So and that practice of literally practicing the whole thing's a practice. And then I think for me personally, it helps me take other things less seriously. It's like I'm just here to practice. And then also that idea of sort of staying on your mat, even when it gets hard, even when you get uncomfortable, that idea of just kind of staying and working through it. And then you practice working through these hard feelings. And I think that is ideal. I wish I did it in middle school, actually, now that you bring it up. I didn't start till I was an adult, but I wish I had done it sooner.
I do something that I think you would love. It's
What's
called
that?
meditations,
Oh,
pet-centered meditations.
well, I love it already. And I have to tell you, I also do something that I call puppy meditation, where I'll meditate. Part of the meditation is holding my dog. So I'm right with there with you on that. I like your name better, though. Meditations. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm writing a book right now about meditations for a middle grader,
Oh, that's
where she
wonderful.
learns where she learns meditations to deal with loneliness with her
I
new
love
dog.
that. That's great.
Yeah, it's fun. Definitely fun to have pets in your life, which brings us to the next question. What kind of things do pets bring in your life?
So I've always had pets. When I was growing up, I was an only child. I guess I still am an only child. And probably my best friend in the world was my golden retriever, Benji. And he was really just like, I have this great picture of me from childhood of just like sitting next to him with my arm around him. Like he was my best bud. And because I think I was an only child, my parents were kind of like, okay, like let's, get whatever pet. So at one point, we had a cat, a dog, I had birds. I had a pet chicken. My grandfather brought me a chicken, not a chick, a chicken, right? My very Italian grandfather brings me this chicken. I named it Esmeralda, and it sort of clucked around the basement for a day. My mom's like, what are we going to do? Esmeralda went to the farm. I had a pet rabbit. I had a hamster. I had gerbils. We had the class guinea pigs. So I've always had animals in my life. And as an adult, I've had cats and my dog, Toby, now, who's 10 this year. So I've always had them in my life, and they are just the most amazing creatures, and they're always there for you, no matter what. So I think that's one thing I love about having pets. And like I said, I get to also spend most of my day figuring out what my dog would say to me if he could talk. So he's tons of material too.
So now we're going to switch gears and talk about the nap books. Do you want to go through them? Do you want me to go through them? Do you want to talk about the themes first? How do you want to approach this?
Yeah, maybe I'll just go through them one by one and talk about them a little bit. I mentioned a little bit about Nat Enough. So Natalie, as I said, gets to school. Her friend doesn't want to be friends with her anymore. And it's also a story of Nat kind of figuring out who she is. So she spent a lot of time kind of chasing this friend and wanting to sort of get that friendship back. And I think the core message of that book is just being more of who you are and also not being. So Nat gets bullied by her friend, and then another kid in school also experiences I had. But her biggest bully was really herself in the form of self-criticism and self-doubt. And so that's sort of an underlying theme as well. And I explore self-doubt a little bit more in Nat for Nothing, which I'll talk about in a minute. But another big point of it also is to surround yourself with people that lift you up instead of put you down. So what happens with Nat is she ends up filling that space with really great friends. And I realized this, and I mentioned this in school talks, that my Lily in my life, who is really an amalgam of people, it's not one specific person. And her best friend Zoe, same thing. It's sort of an amalgam of all of my favorite traits of friends I've had. The person in my life who came in after my Lily, who was not a good friend, we're still friends. So decades later, I am still friends with this person. And I think it's really important to realize, especially at that age, like the people who are important will stick around. And when people fall off, sometimes it's a really good thing. Maybe you just don't line up. It doesn't mean the person's good or bad, just you don't line up anymore. So that's Nat Enough. And then the next book is Forget Me Not, which is all about crushes, which is based on my own childhood experience of asking my crush to the school dance, and he said no. And luckily, I don't have photo evidence of that. I do know what it felt like, so I got to draw that. But that book's really about the idea that the most important relationship we have is with ourselves. And once again, Nat's friends sort of come to the rescue, and she realizes that she's surrounded with some really great people. Let's see. So Absolutely Nat is all about summer camp. So when I was growing up, I was a camp counselor, a counselor in training. I went to art camp and sailing camp. I taught art camp. I had done so many things within camp. And I was also completely terrified of swimming in open water because I never knew thanks to Jaws, I never knew what else was in the water around me. So I got to write about that. So it was about Nat having a new experience, moving out of her comfort zone. She's now with her ex-best friend, Lily. She can't even be with her best friend. So she sort of has to navigate this. But what I really wanted to explore was fear and how we can really easily, and I do this all the time, let fear get in my way. So I wanted to sort of investigate the idea of what happens when we don't let fear get in our way, or what happens when we're afraid, but we do it anyway. So that's really about moving through fear. And then let's see, next is Nat for Nothing. So on the cover of Nat for Nothing are these little creatures that I like to call doubt gremlins. And what's kind of funny about that book, that was the hardest book I wrote. I could not come up with a story. I rewrote it over and over and over again. And funny enough, the whole book is about self-doubt. So how perfect. I'm having my own self-doubt as an artist, as an author, and meanwhile, I'm writing about the voices that get in our head that tell us that we're not good enough or we can't do it. And I think the best validation I had for that, I was watching the Oscars 2 years ago now, and Daniel Kwan had won an Oscar for Everything All at Once and looks at the camera and says, I have my imposter syndrome is at an all-time high. I have low self-esteem. And I'm thinking, how much more validation do you need? You have an Oscar in your hand. But it just goes to show you that artists of all, abilities, backgrounds, and experiences have these same feelings. And I think that they're a good feature. I think the self-doubt helps us get better and helps us learn more and helps us grow as long as we don't let it get in our way. So there's a page in the author's note where, for me, I figured out that I know those voices are going to show up no matter what, especially when I'm doing something important, especially when I'm going out of my comfort zone. So I know they're going to be here. So I figured out like to have them go do 100,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, read a book, watch a movie, play a video game, and get out of the way because I have work to do. So it was really fun to sort of explore that. And there's a character in that book called Mr. Kroger, who is the principal that Nat has to deal with. That is based on a character that I had in my life in college. I was a fine arts major in school, and the head of the art department did not think cartooning was art. So luckily I didn't listen, and I'm super grateful for my fine arts background. So I learned how to paint, oil paint and sculpt and write poetry and do traditional art and kept cartooning at the same time. So I got to sort of write my Mr. Kroger into that story, which was kind of fun. And then have Nat navigate, kind of standing up for what she believes in, creating something that she wanted in her life if it wasn't available to her. And also the idea of, once again, sort of figuring out who you are. And I think in middle school, that's a big question. Like, who am I? Where do I fit in? Am I an athlete? Am I, an artist? Or maybe you're all of those things all at once. So, yeah. And then All Is Not Lost is the most recent one. And that is Nat taking a class trip to Philadelphia, which ends up becoming a much bigger adventure than she ever imagined. And what was so fun for me about this, I went to Philadelphia to research it. And there's like 100 class trips happening the day I went. So I put myself on one, and I got at the end of the line and sort of marched into, I don't remember if it was Congress Hall or Independence Hall, and then met a teacher who was so generous with her information. And she was telling me they're doing a scavenger hunt. So much of our conversation ended up being rolled into the book, which was really neat.
That's really cool. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. There's my synopsis of
So,
all the books at once.
so we can talk a little bit about the structure of the books also. They
Sure.
have the storyline within the panels of the graphic novel, but then you also have other things, like you have, which I loved, how to draw different parts of a comic strip. That was in one of the books. And you have different descriptions of things, of people in some of the books. Like you sort of add these little tidbits as part of the books. And I think that's really endearing.
So that's Natalie's sketchbook. And then at the end of every book is a mini comic, which is basically Nat's comic, which is a synopsis of the whole story in the end of the mini comic. And that's really fun for me because they're all really different. The first one was sort of, they had this jello frog thing happening in science. So she writes a comic with the frogs as the stars. And then in the Philadelphia one, it was all sort of funny historical facts about Philadelphia. So all of those pages also have sort of like a colored pencil look to them. So those are sort of Natalie's view. So it also lets you kind of look a little bit deeper into Natalie's view of the world and see what she's thinking, and also look at life through her lens of humor as well.
And I actually just got a copy of the Super Stories,
Oh,
Superhero,
cool.
and you had a squirrel in there.
Squirrel Girl.
You want
Yeah,
to talk about Squirrel Girl?
I do. So that was a really fun project. I think it was 15 of us. So we're all graphic novelists, all given a different character. So we had to do our rendition of the character drawing wise, but use all the traits of a pre-existing character. I had Squirrel Girl, who I knew nothing about and now know so much about. And it was so fun for me to have to create a story around her. So knowing how my dog feels about squirrels, I brought in Thori, a dog character, and it was really fun working with Marvel on this because they would say, let us know what you need. We've got all kinds of superheroes and creatures and all this. So I kind of came up with a description of what I needed, villain wise, and integrate it. But I had such a fun time with that. It was really, really great. And it was interesting too to kind of be given character parameters and then come up with a pre-existing character and kind of figure out what their story would be.
Yeah, it's a really cute book, and they said that they're going to have more of them.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah.
So, what would you tell your 10-year-old self?
Well, it's funny. I have this great photo that I always show in presentations of me at 10 reading Garfield books. I loved Garfield books. I would read them cover to cover. And I guess when I was growing up, we really didn't have graphic novels, but I also loved the Sunday Funnies. So I would read Sunday Funnies start to finish, every Garfield book when it came out. I loved Calvin and Hobbes books. And I knew that's always what I wanted to do. So I always say that we need is a time machine to go back to my 10-year-old self and say, you're never going to believe this. You're going to have a comic in the newspaper. You're going to write books. And then, weirdly enough, Jim Davis, who I got to meet through the National Cartoonist Society, wrote a blurb for my book. And we've been on Zoom panels together before. So I would have never, ever believed that as a kid. So I would love the opportunity to go back to tell my 10-year-old self, this is all going to work out.
When did it occur to you that you would be able to leave the world of the graphic artist and become a cartoonist and a novelist?
So I think it was around 2006 that I sort of made the switch. And as I mentioned before, I started submitting all over the place. And I think it was that moment when Parade was paying really well for comics and they bought a whole bunch. And I was like, you know what? This might work. And then that sort of led to the next thing. And each sort of magazine led to the next magazine. And then that led to syndicated comics and it led to the book. So it was sort of a slow progression, but it was something I knew I always wanted to do. And it was a very windy path. And, you know, sometimes I say, oh, I wish I had started this sooner, but my graphic design background really helps in what I'm doing now. So I really do believe in right timing and that it's a windy path, but you just follow it where it goes because it eventually gets you where you need to be.
That probably leads into the next question. What would you tell a budding artist or a budding cartoonist?
Oh, okay. So a couple things. So it's very standard that people say read a lot and write a lot and draw a lot. And I also think that it's really important to figure out your own style. But in doing that, a good lesson, and I actually did this even as a fine artist, is to copy other people's work, not to make it your own, but to see how they do it. If you have a favorite character, see how they draw eyes or noses. And then you start to understand things. And like I said, in art school, we would take, you know, masters' paintings and copy them stroke by stroke by stroke to figure out how they did it. How did they handle light? What color did they use? So I think it's a good exercise to do that. And probably the biggest piece of advice is to have fun because making comics and creating a world and creating your own characters is so much fun. And you can absolutely feel that in the work. You know when somebody's having a good time. You can feel that energy in the work. And it's experimental. I always show a picture of my trash can on writing days, which is overflowing. There's no mistakes. Every drawing brings you to the next drawing. Every piece of writing brings you to the next piece of writing. It's all one big experiment. And every time you draw and every time you write, you're learning something new.
Did we miss anything?
Let's see. I'm not sure. You know what I can talk about, which I didn't mention, is the next book, which is coming out, which is called Nat a Chance, which is coming out next spring. And that book is all about Natalie, who does not think she's an athlete. And this was based on my childhood experiences. Always got picked last for gym, decided she is just not an athlete at all. And that going through a couple of situations where she agrees to sign up for a triathlon with her best friend. And it's an echo of my own story in that when I was a kid, I was not an athlete. I joined the soccer team in high school, quit after a week because I didn't want to run the mile warm up. And for me, it was college, joining the rowing team with some friends that really ignited this love of just exercise. And I ended up doing some long distance triathlons, which taught me so much. It was a mental discipline, which was probably the best training I could have ever had for graphic novels. But the big core of that is really about the stories we tell ourselves as far as what we believe to be true, and that those are oftentimes just stories. So this idea that I said I wasn't an athlete, like I'm not a superstar athlete, I'm not, you know, becoming a pro, but yes, I can run, I can ride my bike. So I really love this idea of investigating kind of our beliefs about ourselves.
Interesting. So where can people find you?
So, mariascrivan.com on my website, you'll find all about my books, my greeting cards, my comic. If you go to gocomics.com/half dash full, you can read my comic 3 days a week. And wherever books are sold, you'll probably find the Nat series.
Great. Well, thank you so very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm sure people are really going to enjoy hearing about writing a graphic novel. And this is the first time we have a cartoonist on the show. So I'm sure
Cool.
people are going to be real interested. And thanks a lot.
Thank you.